Good evening. Thank you, Toby, for turning up today and allowing us to waste a bit of your time. The Free Speech Union, they've been involved in an ongoing story that's been top of the, I don't know, headlines for over a week now, and that's the case of the Eton teacher, Mr. Knowland. Can you tell me what's been going on there? I think he got in touch with you, the General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, to perhaps represent him a bit in some of the events that have happened.
Yeah, he's a member of the Free Speech Union, and he joined some time ago. He didn't just join because this particular uh, event blew up. So what happened is that in September, he made a video lecture for a strand in the Eton curriculum called Perspectives, and it is intended for pupils aged 16 and above. And the idea of Perspectives is to introduce sixth form students to a range of big controversial issues and to encourage them to think through those issues themselves and come up with a kind of defensible position. And they're not supposed to be themselves um, uh, representing lots of different views. The way these video lectures are made as part of the course is that they take a particular point of view. They're quite polemical. Lots of people who've seen Will Knowland's video lecture on YouTube have said this is a very one-sided view of this subject, but actually it's supposed to be a one-sided view. That's what the teachers are supposed to do in this particular curriculum strand. And in this particular video lecture, Mr. Knowland takes issue with radical feminist orthodoxy. I think for the most part, the boys at Eton are taught that masculinity is quite suspect, if not entirely toxic. And organizations like the Good Lad Initiative come in to do training with the boys. Laura Bates of the Everyday Sexism Project. So quite a lot of the information the boys receive on masculinity, other gender issues, this whole kind of subject area is very one-sided. And so Mr. Knowland thought it would be useful for the boys to have another perspective. So his video lecture is a critique of radical feminist orthodoxy, quite a robust critique. When he initially uploaded this to the school intranet, so the boys could view it, a member of staff complained. We don't know what the gender of that member of staff is, but the complaint was that if female members of staff are being asked to discuss the contents of this video lecture with pupils, that will be a degrading and humiliating experience and will therefore constitute harassment and a form of discrimination which is unlawful according to the Equality Act 2010. When the headmaster received this complaint, I think there were then subsequent similar complaints put in, I think there was more than one, he sought legal advice. And I think the legal advice he received was that if a claim was brought against the school, a discrimination claim by a female member of staff along those lines, it might be successful in the employment tribunal, and therefore it was advisable if this was taken down from the school intranet. He then asked Mr. Knowland to take it down and said, "I'm sorry, you can't teach this. There's been a complaint." He complied with that request, and then he told the headmaster that he had also uploaded it to his personal YouTube channel. And so the headmaster asked him to take it down from his YouTube channel too. And this is where we kind of, I think, stray into a grey area. I think it's quite grey as to whether the Equality Act would have prescribed the particular lesson that Will Knowland devised being taught in the school. But I think it's even greyer as to whether it would prescribe him uploading this to his personal YouTube channel, given that it does say that he teaches at Eton on his YouTube channel. So there is a link between him and the school on the channel. And then Will asked the head teacher, headmaster, I think he calls himself, why he wanted him to take it down from his personal YouTube channel. And the headmaster at that point was unable, at least according to Mr. Knowland, to give him a good reason. And I think that's because the headmaster had only sought legal advice at that stage about the lawfulness of teaching the lesson and not the lawfulness of including it on the YouTube channel. So he wasn't prepared to commit and say you've got to take it down from YouTube because that's what the Equality Act dictates. So he didn't give Will a good reason, at least in Will's view, and so Will didn't take it down. The headmaster then said, if you don't take it down, I'm going to suspend you and investigate you, and that could lead to a disciplinary process which might lead to your dismissal for gross misconduct. Will still declined to take it down. He was suspended, investigated, put through a disciplinary process, and sacked for gross misconduct. And he appealed that decision. And the appeal was on Monday of this week. And they haven't yet said whether they're going to uphold his appeal or deny it. But they need to inform him within 7 days. So we will know, I think, by next Monday what Eton has decided to do. I think it was on Tuesday, actually, that the appeal was, as far as I feel.
There's quite a few issues there. One of which is who owns a lesson. I mean, is it when it's recorded? I mean, this is the other thing about digital lessons. Of course, most of the time this would have taken place behind a classroom door, and perhaps no one would have known more about it.
Yes.
But who owns the lesson? If it's done in school time, and bearing in mind that Eton is an institution that seems to go on for weeks. Of course, it's 24/7, isn't it? Is it Eton's or is it the teachers?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. As I understand it, it's not commonplace for these lessons to be turned into videos so the boys can view them. I think that's just something that has coincided with COVID, because not all the boys are present at the school, and I don't think face-to-face lessons are routinely, or were at that stage anyway, routinely taking place. But as far as I know, the school hasn't made a copyright claim. It hasn't said, take down the video lecture from your personal YouTube channel because we own the copyright and you're in breach of that copyright. That isn't an argument they've made. The argument they've made is twofold. I think they've subsequently said, I think the headmaster sought additional legal advice from an equalities barrister, a barrister who specializes in equality law. And that barrister's advice was, yes, the YouTube putting this video lecture on the YouTube channel is also something that could expose the school to a claim in the employment tribunal by a female member of staff. So that's the main argument, I think, that's subsequently been made as to why he should take down the video. But I also think that there's another argument, which is that it's a breach. I think that they claim it's a breach of Eton's social media policy, whereby the staff can't do anything likely to bring the school into disrepute. Lots of companies have these kind of quite far-reaching social media policies, which gives them a pretext to police what people say outside the workplace. And it's something that the Free Speech Union has run up against several times in connection with our members. I mean, I think one thing that really concerns me about this case is that if Will's appeal isn't upheld, I think other schools will conclude that the Eton headmaster's interpretation of the Equality Act and what it prescribes being taught as part of the curriculum is legally sound, and will then worry themselves if they get a complaint from a member of a protected group claiming that teaching something or discussing something else that's been taught with the boys is prohibited by the Equality Act. And so if his appeal fails, I think that could have a very chilling effect on free speech in schools. And I do think, I mean, I've obviously sought the opinion of several equalities barristers about this as well. And their view is that the Eton headmaster's interpretation, or the legal interpretation he was provided with, is a very conservative, hyper cautious interpretation. And if you look at the Equality Act, there are in the supplementary notes, there's something to the effect that it shouldn't be applied, it shouldn't restrict what's taught in the classroom. And the Equality and Human Rights Commission subsequently issued guidance in 2019 saying that they don't think it should be used, it shouldn't be invoked in that way either. But I do think that the Equality Act is poorly drafted and is sufficiently ambiguous on these critical points for it to be interpreted in this way. So I think what really needs to happen long term is the Equality Act needs to either be scrapped or amended. And one of the things the Free Speech Union intends to do when this is sort of blown over is to get an MP to propose something like a 2-line bill amending the Equality Act to make it absolutely clear that it can't be invoked and was never intended to be used to limit what's taught in the classroom. If some members of staff find the content of a lesson offensive, but nonetheless it's perfectly lawful in every other respect, then that wouldn't be a good reason for the school not to teach that particular subject or introduce children to those particular ideas. I mean, you can imagine, a teacher objecting to the teaching of To Kill a Mockingbird on the grounds that they find the kind of white savior motif offensive. Certainly, To Kill a Mockingbird has been widely kind of cancelled across the American public high school system for those reasons. It's considered now to be a problematic text. It's still, I think, pretty widely taught in the UK, and you can imagine if people trying to take advantage of the Equality Act to claim that it's offensive and shouldn't be taught. And I think we need to amend the Equality Act just to make it crystal clear that it cannot be used in that way.
Now, interesting thing to pursue there. Before we get into the curriculum content thing, is about a teacher giving their own view across about something, especially if it's something controversial. And we have two speakers who sort of differed on their opinions on this, both of whom might be from a similar angle to yourself on things, and that's Calvin Robinson and Claire Fox. And Claire was saying that teachers should share their own viewpoints on things. And Calvin was sort of disagreeing with that, saying that actually it's a teacher should be more objective and step outside a bit from involving their own views and try and represent a range of views in what they teach. Where would you stand on that?
I'm with Claire Fox on that one, but with one proviso. I don't think there's anything wrong in teachers sharing a particular point of view or teaching a lesson from one particular perspective. I think it would be very difficult to ask them not to do that or to try and enforce compliance with such a policy. But the proviso is that the children shouldn't be introduced to just one perspective, one point of view, particularly on big controversial issues. They should be exposed to a range of views. So, some of our members have complained that in the wake of the BLM protests earlier this year, their children are being bombarded with BLM supporting messages which draw on critical race theory and portray Britain as being systemically racist and portray the police, the British police, as being institutionally racist and don't allow for any progress in race relations over the past 25 years. Britain is very much depicted as a kind of a place in which if you're not white, you very much are regarded as a second-class citizen and have far fewer opportunities than if you're white. I think it's perfectly fine for children to be exposed to that point of view, but they should also be exposed to an alternative point of view, which is actually we do have we've made a lot of progress. We may not have Britain may not be perfect. There may still be pockets of racism, but an enormous amount of progress has been made, particularly in the past 25 years by many anti-racist campaigners and equality campaigners like Trevor Phillips. Yeah, so I don't think there's anything wrong with children being exposed to controversial ideas, controversial perspectives on big hot button issues, but they shouldn't be just exposed to one point of view. I think the problem I have and lots of our members have is that schools are just teaching them one particular narrative on the theme of racism, and that is the BLM narrative. And that's a perfectly legitimate point of view, but it's not the only legitimate point of view. And I think children should be exposed to a range of views, particularly on that issue.
I mean, do you know that, or is that just a sense you're getting?
Well, do I know that children are, for the
I mean,
most
do you
part,
have figures on that? I mean, is there research in that, or is it
no,
just a sense of it?
No, it's just a sense. I mean, we've had. I'd say we've had about half a dozen complaints from members who are concerned that their children are essentially just being taught about this issue from a critical race theory perspective and not from any other perspective. But no, we haven't done a survey or anything like that. So it
Right.
might be that those are exceptional, but I'd be surprised if they were exceptional. I expect that's what's happening in a lot of schools.
Now, if a teacher was a member of the BNP, and this is something that came up a long time ago. Perhaps it's not such a big issue now. I don't know if the BNP even still exists, but of the right, extreme right, would you be happy for them to have freedom of speech in the classroom?
I think I think if a member of the BNP taught children some of the things that the BNP believes, then that teacher might run afoul of the Public Order Act, which prohibits the stirring up of racial hatred. I think I'd be hesitant to prohibit any teacher from teaching children something which is perfectly lawful. Um, uh, and um, uh, and I think and I don't think that the Equality Act should be interpreted in such a way as to essentially make any dissent from woke orthodoxy unlawful.
Right. What do you think of the vote at Cambridge University a couple of days ago?
Yeah, I was very pleased by that result, and particularly the margin of victory. Cambridge University had, well, the Vice Chancellor, the Senate, I think, of Cambridge University, had issued a new free speech policy. And the policy required students and academics and visiting speakers to be respectful of other people's points of view, to treat other points of view with respect. And various academics, one in particular called Arif Ahmed, who's a philosophy don at Gonville Keys, were concerned that this might in future be invoked to limit what it is academics can teach, to no platform, invited speakers, and so forth. We saw this last year when uh, Jordan Peterson was initially invited by the divinity faculty, I think, of Cambridge to become a visiting fellow and give a series of lectures. And then a photograph turned up of Jordan Peterson being standing next to a fan at one of his events wearing a proud Islamophobe t-shirt. And that was then used as a reason for rescinding the invitation for him to become a visiting fellow on the grounds that Muslim students would feel disrespected by Jordan Peterson's presence at the university because of this photograph. Now, I think legitimately, Arif and others were concerned that this new policy would be invoked to limit academic free speech because of this requirement that they show other points of view respect. So they got that changed. They proposed amending it to replace the word respect with tolerate. So people aren't required to respect points of view they violently disagree with. They're not required to respect your BNP chap you mentioned earlier. They're not required to respect kind of white nationalism as a point of view any more than they're required to respect critical race theory. They're just required now to tolerate those different points of view, i.e., not try and no platform people who hold them. And I think that's a much better policy, and I think will make for a much more robust protection of academic free speech. And I'd like to see similar policies and declarations made by other universities. The reason it's happened at Cambridge is because the administration can't just impose a policy on the academic staff. There has to be a vote on it, and there was a vote on it, and Arif and his side won handsomely. But in other universities, unfortunately, these sorts of policies are imposed by administrators all the time, and there's very little opportunity, no mechanism by which they can be rejected or dissented from by academics.
Should Millwall fans tolerate footballers taking the knee?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That would, I think, Millwall fans booing the taking of the knee would certainly have been prohibited by the original Cambridge free speech policy, which requires you to respect other people's points of view, because it certainly isn't respectful to boo them. But I'm inclined to think that booing uh, uh, isn't a form of intolerance so much as an expression of disagreement. I think if they had actually tried to prevent the footballers in some way from taking the knee or expressing their their allegiance to BLM, if that's what they were doing, that would have been intolerant. But I think merely booing is just a way of making their feelings known, and they're as entitled to express their point of view as the footballers are, I think.
And you're a QPR fan, of course, I believe, and so you might have a view on this in more
Well,
ways than one.
Well, funnily
Um,
enough, Martin, that came up because before this Millwall episode, there was another episode in which QPR players didn't take the knee at a
yeah,
game, whereas the other players in that game did at the beginning of the game, and QPR were criticised for that, and the one the director of football at QPR, who is black, said, "Look, we do an enormous amount to combat racism at this football club. We do a lot in the community, working with young people. We may not be we may not be up there when it comes to virtue signalling how anti-racist we are, but our anti-racist credentials are second to none." I thought it was it was Les Ferdinand, a very good, very robust response to that criticism of QPR's players. And of course, since then they have taken the knee.
there was applauded as well at the Millwall match by the fans, a different set of fans perhaps, but interesting how that moved. If you were a black student in a classroom, a black player on a football pitch, and you thought your teacher and or your fans were against you in some way because of the color of the skin, would you tolerate that?
I think it would depend upon. Uh, I think it would depend upon what that suspicion was based on. I mean, someone could accuse a teacher of being racist, and that accusation might be completely baseless. I mean, one of the problems with the way the Equality Act is interpreted is that people say if someone perceives that they're being harassed, if a member of a protected category perceives that they are the victim of discrimination or harassment, then that alone, some people read it as saying that alone means that they are being harassed. Nothing trumps the subjective perception of the victim, according to that reading of the Equality Act. Well, there is that subjective clause in the Equality Act, but there are also other clauses, including a reasonableness clause, which says, is it reasonable for the victim to claim in these circumstances that they have been the victim of discrimination, that they feel harassed? Often that reasonable person standard is lost sight of when schools and universities claim that such and such a view is prohibited because someone somewhere at the university or in the school might be offended or might perceive themselves to be discriminated against in virtue of whatever it is that's being said. So I think if a complaint is made about a particular teacher being racist, I think the school should inquire into whether that is a reasonable perception for the person in question to have. It could easily be just the settling of a score, or it could be that someone's misinterpreted what the teacher says. I mean, this comes up in schools all the time when I think the N word appears in Of Mice and Men. And sometimes teachers, when reading out passages from Mice and Men, or when asking children to read out passages in the classroom, the teacher or the children will use the N word. And you can imagine some members of the class objecting to that. But so then the question is, well, is that reasonable or not? I think that if you're merely repeating a word on a page that was written many years ago, and which has a specific meaning in that context, which and you might distort the meaning of the text in question if you were to replace it. I don't think it would be reasonable to claim that either the teacher or the pupil who read out that word was being racist by using that word.
I suppose the counter argument would be, if these things happen a lot, though, that it's sort of blown over. It doesn't matter. These are just one-off incidences, but there's many of them. Then it becomes an idea. Perhaps the school is systemically racist, rather than these are just individual moments that perhaps can be brushed under the carpet.
Yeah, I would be skeptical if someone claimed that a school was systemically racist. Just as I'm skeptical when people make that claim about universities. Universities UK issued some guidance, I think, last week, intended to address what it calls the widespread racism of British universities. And this was based on an Equality and Human Rights Commission survey that was published last year. Well, I've read that survey, and I published a piece by a professor at Exeter called Doug Stokes in Quillette, where I work as an editor, which looked at the methodology underpinning that survey, and actually the evidence of racism, the number of actual racist incidents, the number complained about, the complaints made about racist incidents which were successful, which were upheld, is incredibly small. And actually, schools like universities, I believe, are among the least racist institutions in the world, just as museums and galleries and theatre companies are amongst the least racist institutions, organisations in the world. I mean, it became very fashionable, particularly in the wake of the BLM protests, for these, scrupulously anti-racist institutions to denounce themselves for being racist and for being complicit in a system of white supremacy. And I think it was a sort of almost a ritualized form of self-flagellation, and perhaps isn't intended to be taken at face value. I'm not sure. It's quite hard to tell. But the idea that, the National Portrait Gallery, or a school or a university is riddled from top to bottom with racism and racists is very far-fetched. I mean, this came up recently in the US. Princeton, the president of Princeton in the US, issued one of these pro forma BLM solidarity statements in which he denounced both, I think, himself and the institution for being systemically racist. And Betsy DeVos, Trump's education secretary, said, oh, well, hang on a minute. If you're a systemically racist institution and you are as riddled with racists as your statement implies, then perhaps you shouldn't be in receipt of federal funding. And when you last received federal funding, you did give an undertaking that you weren't a racist institution and that you didn't tolerate racism. So if you are really as racist as you're describing yourself, then I think we have to investigate this. And I would like Oliver Dowden, the culture secretary, to take a similar view of all these British institutions, which are funded by the taxpayer via the Arts Council. If they're claiming to be if they really are as racist as they're claiming to be, then why is the British taxpayer giving them so much money? Ditto with schools and universities. If schools really are, systemically racist, and black and brown students are routinely discriminated against in the classroom in some way which is inextricably bound up with the school, then that school should be closed down. But I don't believe it for a second.
If a teacher is drawn to the Free Speech Union, do they have to be right-wing in the first place? Isn't there something about your own reputation and perhaps the Free Speech Union's reputation that it is basically an organization for people with rather right of center, shall we say, views?
Well, I think that may be a perception, possibly because I'm right of centre, but that's certainly not the case. We are a non-partisan organisation and we welcome members from all parties. And only recently we complained to Royal Holloway after it no-platformed the ex-Labour MP Chris Williamson. But many of our members are gender-critical feminists who we routinely defend when they're attacked in the public square, and most of them, I imagine, are Labour Party voters. So I think it's a common misapprehension that the main beneficiaries of free speech are male, pale, and stale conservatives like me. But actually, that's not the case. Ira Glasser, the legendary ex-head of the American Civil Liberties Union, made this point very forcefully recently in an interview in Spiked. And he said that without various landmark First Amendment victories being won by the ACLU in the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights, the organizers of the civil rights movement, wouldn't have been able to organize, march, protest. It was absolutely critically dependent on its First Amendment speech rights being protected in order to get underway, get off the ground. And I think actually free speech is the friend of minorities and historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups, not the enemy. I think it's a grotesque misunderstanding. And actually, if you care about social justice, if you care about certain people in our community being disempowered, being treated as second-class citizens, then free speech is your friend, not your enemy. It's free speech which enables you, your free speech protections, to point out those things, to protest about them, to write about them in newspapers and elsewhere. I think it's a false dichotomy, and very much an impression I want to disabuse people of.
And just to be clear, did you say you represented Chris Williamson?
No, he's not a member, but we
Right.
did write to object to Royal Holloway after he was no platformed.
Okay. Good to clear that one up. In terms of teachers, they have their own unions. Why join the Free Speech Union?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I expect most teachers won't choose to join either a teaching union or the free speech union, but will probably join both if they join us. But I do think that the teaching unions and other trade unions haven't been very robust when it comes to standing up for the speech rights of their members, which is disappointing considering that was one of the reasons for the trade union movement getting off the ground in the 19th century. It was to make sure that workers weren't fired for supporting the Independent Labour Party and criticising capitalism and protesting about working conditions. But more recently, trade unions haven't been particularly robust. I mean, a good example is the UCU, which is the largest academic trade union. It opposed the recent amendment to Cambridge's free speech policy. So it was supported, it turned out, by an overwhelming majority of those who voted in that particular vote. I mean, I think the winners, the pro-amendment, the pro-tolerance people outvoted the pro-respect people by a margin of something like 6 or 7 to 1. So UCU, I don't think, can have been articulating the feelings of its members in Cambridge when it supported the respect version of that policy and opposed the tolerate version of that policy. But that's, I'm afraid, typical. UCU and other trade unions are in the habit of prioritizing emotional safety over intellectual freedom in universities and in schools.
Toby, it's such a hot topic, and the culture wars continue. And it's the sort of thing that might get a few of our viewers irate, perhaps hot under the collar. So if any of them want to perhaps put something in the comments below, please do, or perhaps come on the show yourself to argue perhaps a different viewpoint. Perspectives, as Toby says, is what we're all about. Thank you, Toby, for talking to us this evening.
Thanks, Martin.
You can run and hide, but you will find that where you go, the blues go. You may think you're